What if I told you that wasn't recorded in LA in front of 5,000 people? What if I told you it was actually recorded in my bedroom? And what if I told you it wasn't even recorded with an amp? Pretty cool, right? Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while and you're aware of some of my musical influences, then it probably won't come as a massive surprise to discover that I'm a pretty serious valve amp kind of guy. I've never really been into amp sims, I've never really been into helixes or anything like that. I've never really been into anything solid state at all, to be honest with you. So, this is a bit of a weird video for me to make. I guess the natural question is, why am I making it? Well, it all started a few months ago when I was looking into amp sims online. Because, as you can imagine, miking up a crank tube amp every time you want to record a YouTube video is not fantastic for neighbour relations. To be honest, I didn't have the highest expectations, but with all the new amp sims coming into the market, like the Boss IR2 and all the Universal Audio stuff, I figured there must be some good stuff out there. So after doing a considerable amount of research online, I finally came across an amp sim that kind of caught my eye. It's made by a small Chilean company called DSM and Humboldt, and they call it the Simplifier. Now, what's cool about this amp sim in particular is that technically it's not actually an amp sim at all. They call it the first 0-watt amplifier because this thing is actually completely analog. Well, almost completely analog. The only thing that isn't is the reverb that's on a sidechain. But anyway, basically completely analog. Sounded pretty cool to me. Another thing that I really immediately liked about it is that it doesn't lead to the kind of decision paralysis that you get with something like a Helix where you've got a million tonal options. I mean, that kind of stuff is great, but for me, I just wanted something that I could plug in, spend 5 or 6 seconds dialing in a tone, and play. Just like a valve amp. The only thing is this thing is kind of like having 3 valve amps in one. So let's go over some of the features and then talk about why, if you've already got a tube amp, why you would consider maybe getting one of these. And there are a few pretty good reasons. Anyway, you've got this really beautiful, slick looking interface that might look a little confusing, but give it a second because it's really not too bad. What's really cool about the Simplifier is that you've got the ability to control all the different elements of the amp separately. So you've got the power amp section, the preamp section, and then the 2 stereo cabinets, along with all the EQ and volume controls that you'd expect to see on an amp. And then you've also got the reverb on a little dial on the side. Now this is where it gets kind of interesting because, as you can see, there's a switch by the power amp, the preamp, and both the cabinets. Now when the switch is in the middle position, you're in the USA setting, aka Fender. When they're all the way down, they're in the MS Brit section, Marshall, and then when they're all the way up, they're in the AC Brit section, yeah, you guessed it, Vox. So this is kind of like having 3 valve amps in one. But of course it doesn't even stop there because you can combine all of these to create combinations of amps that don't even exist in real life. So you could put a Marshall power amp in a Fender amp, or you could pair a Vox preamp, a Marshall power amp, and 2 Fender cabinets. You know, there's just so many interesting tonal options without the pedal just being completely overwhelming. In terms of outputs, it's got 2 XLR stereo outputs that you can plug directly into a PA or an audio interface. It's also got 2 stereo jack outputs, and then it's also got a headphone output as well. So yes, that means that if you're going for a weekend away and you want to bring your guitar so you can have a bit of a practice, all you need to bring is this, and these. And a guitar cable, obviously. Pretty cool if you ask me. But anyway, now that we've run through some of the features, let's go through some of the tones. Okay, so sounds pretty damn good to me. It's got a really big and rich stereo sound, and it's got a lot of clarity all the way from those really clean tones to those more distorted ones where you really start pushing the power amp and the preamp. I absolutely love the Marshall and the Fender tones. I'm a little bit less sold on the Vox tones, but that might just be because I'm a little bit less fond of Vox amps in general. I also think the plate reverb that this thing has sounds really, really great. It's got a really lovely tail, but it's just short enough that even when you've got a lot of reverb on, you still have all that clarity and you don't kind of get lost in your own reverb trail. But yeah, I mean, I was genuinely super impressed the first time I played through this. So, at least in my opinion, we've established that it sounds great. So why, if you've already got a tube amp, would you consider buying one of these things? Well, here are a few of those reasons, and maybe one or two drawbacks to think about as well. Number one, versatility. I think I probably speak for most people when I say I can't afford a really nice Fender amp, a really nice Marshall amp, and a really nice Vox amp. And even if I could, I've got no idea where I'd put them all. Now I know this pedal isn't cheap, it's around 300 quid, which is quite expensive, but it's a hell of a lot cheaper than any top of the range valve amp would cost you, and this pedal is basically 3 of those in one. But I mean, yeah, from a personal point of view, because of the kind of cost and the logistics of having lots of amps, I've only ever really played through Fender amps, and for my entire guitar playing life, that's kind of been the building blocks to my tone. Now, I'm also obviously a pretty massive Hendrix fan, and Hendrix played predominantly through Marshall. So one of the first things I did when I got this pedal was switch all the switches to Marshall, and there it was, suddenly a tone that I'd never been able to achieve before. It sounds silly, but it was genuinely one of the most exciting moments of my guitar playing life recently. I think that pretty much hits the nail on the head really. Just gives you access to all of these interesting and amazing tones that you would otherwise never be able to experience without spending 5 or 6 grand. Okay, so reason number 2. Now, as someone that does a decent amount of recording, both professionally and personally, having a really consistently great sounding tone is really important. And with the Simplifier, what you hear is what you get. Now that might sound really obvious, but the amount of times I've got my amplifier sounding absolutely amazing, mic'd it up, recorded it, listened back and just thought, that doesn't sound anywhere near as good as it did whilst I was playing. Now with a Simplifier, you don't lose any of that tone through the miking up process, because you don't need to mic it up. So what you hear whilst you're playing is exactly what you're going to hear when you listen back to it, which is really important and handy. Also, if you have mic'd up guitar amps in the past, you'll know that there are so many different variables that affect your tone, even down to the room that you're in. With this thing, you're going to sound exactly the same in here as you will out here. Pretty cool, right? So, reason number 3, and we've already touched on this ever so slightly, but practicality. I love the fact that if you're turning up to a recording session, a rehearsal, or even a gig, literally all you need to bring is your pedal board with a Simplifier attached to the end, and a guitar. Also, by the way, I haven't mentioned, this thing actually takes pedals really well. So if you just want to set it to a great clean sound, just like you would with an amp, and then run all your pedals into it, then it's also a really great option. It's quite a few positives for you. I promise I'm not sponsored by these guys. I was just really impressed when I got my hands on one of these things. So yeah, to counter that, this is probably one of the biggest drawbacks to using an amp sim. The Simplifier does do a great job at sounding like a valve amp. To be honest, I think listening back to the recordings, it would be incredibly hard to tell that it isn't. That being said, sounding like a tube amp isn't necessarily the same thing as feeling like a tube amp. And I think this is where a lot of amp sims just can't compete. There is a certain responsiveness that you get when you're playing through a cranked valve amp that you just can't really replicate in any other way. Amp sims always seem to feel just that little bit synthesized and just not quite organic, if that makes sense. I don't know, I guess it just doesn't feel quite as alive as playing directly out of a tube amp. But yeah, I'm by no means saying it doesn't feel great to play, because it really does. But that being said, if I had the choice between playing through a cranked tube amp every time I wanted to practice, and turning up my monitors really loud and playing through the Simplifier, I think 9 times out of 10, I'd probably still pick the tube amp. the real magic in this thing for me is recording, because even though it might not feel quite as good as a valve amp when you're playing, it's going to sound amazing when you listen back to it every single time. Anyway, on that note, that pretty much brings us to the end of the video. So thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, as always, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe, and let me know what you thought about the Simplifier down in the comments below. So yeah, like, subscribe, all of that stuff, and most importantly, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.